Hey everybody, welcome to my fourth video in a series of videos for Fury of Dracula. Now in this video I'm going to give you my final thoughts and opinions on the game itself. If you want to see an overview, learn how to play the game, or actually watch some sample gameplay, make sure you check out my other videos for Fury of Dracula. Now Fury of Dracula is a hidden movement and deduction game, which is a genre that does not have a lot of games in it. You basically have games such as Letters from Whitechapel, where players are either the detectives or they're Jack the Ripper, and Jack's trying to hide from the detectives, and the detectives are trying to hunt down Jack. Or you have games such as Spectre Ops, which is a futuristic game full of corporate espionage, where one of the players, or possibly a second hidden traitor, is trying to escape while the rest of the players are hunters trying to hunt him down before he escapes with some corporate espionage. So this is a genre of games that quite honestly just does not have a lot of games for it. So to say a game is a great game in the genre is almost being silly at this point, because we don't have a lot of competition. You don't have to try that hard to be great. But luckily, in the case of Fury of Dracula, it's a great game, not just because it's a very minute genre, but it's a great game because it's just well designed, especially if you enjoy games that allow hidden movement, team-based gameplay, where one player is trying to stay away from the other players, while the other players are trying to hunt them down, and you're trying to deduce where the bad guy is, trying to use all your powers, all your abilities, and all your reasoning, while the other player, the bad guy, is trying to do everything they do to stay away from you. Except in Fury of Dracula, this is a game of cat and mouse, where you never know who the cat is and you're never quite sure who the mouse is, because in this game, Dracula has a bite. Pardon the pun. You see, one of the things I really enjoy about Fury of Dracula is the fact that Dracula in this game doesn't have to constantly hide, constantly play the mouse, and constantly try to stay away from the hunters. As a matter of fact, due to the influence track and how influence works, it's actually a good idea for Dracula to occasionally put the pressure on the hunters, hunt them down and attack them and try to get a bite on them, because if Dracula can manage to bite the hunters, especially after they've been mesmerized, or especially if they manage to play other cards on them, it's possible for Dracula to gain influence, and it becomes much more powerful as the weeks go on. So even though the hunters, as the weeks are going on, are getting more powerful because they're getting more item cards as the weeks are going on, Dracula is also getting more powerful because as the influence track raises up through these despair tokens, the more despair tokens there are, the more influence Dracula is going to get every time he goes out there and bites the hunters. So the game kind of has an interesting pace to it, because as the hunters are getting more powerful, Dracula is also getting more reasons to go out there and go down and hunt after the hunters. So again, this game of cat and mouse becomes a game of cat and mouse, where again, Dracula is occasionally the cat, and occasionally the hunters are the cat. But again, you must know when to play your role, how to play your role well, and when it's good to hide, when it's good to hunt, and that creates a very interesting theme to the game, which is really cool because this is a thematic game based off of Bram Stoker's Dracula, where Dracula is really a bad guy. There's no sparkles here, no teen angst or anything like this. This is the purest form of Dracula, the evil Dracula who has spies everywhere. People are willing to do his bidding because he's a horrible, horrible creature who's mesmerized them, and these hunters are doing everything they can to hunt him down. And the game even manages to match the theme really, really well by the fact that when players are making their decisions, they have to make their decisions in front of the Dracula player, which is very thematic. It kind of matches the book and the time period where Dracula had spies everywhere, and so he can pick up on exactly what the hunters are doing. Unless, of course, they're making trades in private. You can't hear anything on that. But that's really, really cool how they have the theme for the game, because it all fits really well into the classic theme of Bram Stoker's Dracula. Fury of Dracula also does a fantastic job of keeping the pace and the pressure on the hunters at all times, to the point that the hunters cannot always make the best decisions, and that adds a lot of fun to the game, especially for the Dracula player. See, as I've mentioned, this game is played out over weeks, and at the end of every single week, one of these despair tokens are going to be added to the track. As these despair tokens keep getting added to the track, it becomes much, much easier for Dracula to go ahead and match his influence, and again, influence is what Dracula needs to win the game. If he ever gets to 13 influence, Dracula wins the game instantly. So as the time is going by, as the weeks are going by, more despair tokens are going to be added to the map. It's going to be easier for Dracula to gain the influence, and as a matter of fact, if we ever make it to the fourth week, every single day of the game, as long as Dracula is willing to move into the cities, any city on the board, doesn't matter where it is, as long as Dracula moves into one of the cities, Dracula is going to gain influence, which means the pressure is constantly on the hunters. So the hunters cannot sit back and play it safe, moving around during the day, and making sure that they only do explorations during the day and only do supply actions during the day. So the hunters they're forced to go out there and make bad decisions, and those bad decisions are going to give Dracula the event cards he needs to make life much more difficult for the hunters. So it creates an interesting flow of the game because the hunters always want to make the best decisions, but they know due to the time pressures of this clock that's constantly ticking down, ticking down, and ticking down, lets them know that they can't make the best time-sensitive decisions. So sometimes they have to make the bad decisions. They have to go out there and do what they can because they know that it's a race against time, and time is definitely never on the hunter side. I also really enjoy the revamp that Fantasy Flight Games did to the combat system. Now, before we go anywhere, you need to understand that I come from the first edition of the game. I completely bypassed the second edition. I moved into the third edition. And to add to confusion, the first edition is the Games Workshop edition. The second edition is actually Fantasy Flight's first edition of the game, and Fury of Dracula third edition is technically Fantasy Flight's second edition of the game. So even though this is the third edition, it's actually Fantasy Flight's second edition. And well, we almost need a diagram to go ahead and explain this, it feels like. But my point is that they did a great revamp to the combat system, and they've gone from a complete luck-based roll of the dice combat system style of game where you're never quite sure the outcome of it, to more of a mental game where the players are basically trying to judge each other constantly by using what, again, very limited knowledge you have. And again, you may have some knowledge, you may have a lot of knowledge, but again, you have to take advantage of what knowledge you have to try to outguess your opponent, try to figure out which kind of combat cards they're playing, while Dracula is trying to do the exact same thing, trying to guess what his opponents are doing, trying to figure out if this is a combat he can win, and trying to play the right combat cards he can, because you're always limited in combat as Dracula, because remember, you have 13 combat cards. While some of them are duplicated, you only can have 5 of them in your hand at a time. And the really interesting thing about the combat, and it makes such a minor difference to the combat, but you don't draw your combat cards as Dracula until you actually initialize the combat. So you can't look at your combat hand in advance and go, I have a lot of good combat cards. I'm going to go into combat because I'm pretty sure I'm going to win it. It never quite works like that because you're going to draw your entire hand of cards and realize that you didn't get any of the cards you need, and then you're going to realize as Dracula that you just might be in trouble. So it creates a really interesting back and forth between the Dracula player and the hunter players because you never quite know just how a combat's going to turn out. It's always a little bit of a risk, always a little bit of a gamble, but it's not a gamble because of the roll of the dice. It's a gamble because you're trying to fight the cards the hunters have. You're trying to fight the cards that you may draw as Dracula, and you're trying to outsmart your opponent by using the knowledge you may have because it may be bitten, use the knowledge you may have just because you've done a fight without hunter before, or just trying to abuse any knowledge you can to outthink, outsmart, and outwit your opponents. It creates a really interesting form of combat that I really enjoyed. And I also like the fact that when it comes to combat, Dracula versus a hunter one-on-one, Dracula's got a really good shot of winning. But once more hunters start coming into the fray, it becomes much harder for Dracula to win, to the point that if Dracula ever gets in a combat with 3 hunters, even if he enters it with a full amount of life, there's a good chance that Dracula's going to get completely stomped and get a stake put right through his heart. So at this point, it should come as no surprise to you if I say that I really enjoyed Fury of Dracula. I think it's a fantastic game. As a matter of fact, it's now pretty much my go-to hidden trader game. It's going to replace all the hidden trader games I have in my collection, except for Mr. Jack, because Mr. Jack does play a little differently, and this isn't a review about Mr. Jack, so let's leave that at that. But I will say that this is a fantastically done hidden movement and deduction game. It is my favorite one in the entire genre. It beats out all the other games that try to do exactly just what Fury of Dracula does. So having said that, is Fury of Dracula a perfect game? No, it's not. There's a couple different things you need to realize about this game. The first thing you need to realize is that the game is 100% balanced for 5 players. That does mean that you have to have all 4 of the hunters, and you definitely have to have the Dracula player, because it wouldn't be much Fury without Dracula himself. But that does mean that depending on the amount of players, some players are going to have to play at least 1 hunter, possibly 2 hunters, or even maybe all 4 of the hunters. And now when you're playing this game with 5 players, it's fantastic. The table talk is awesome. The theme of the game is awesome. And the flow of the game just goes fantastically as players just move around the board, and the gameplay happens very quickly, very enjoyably. And I even like how the turn structure of the game goes to make sure that nobody's really sitting around bored for very long. Because Dracula's role in the game is to sit back, to eavesdrop, to listen and try to figure out what the hunters are doing, while the hunters are taking their turns in order. Then we go to the night phase, and the hunters get to do another action. It's really nice how they do that, and I love the flow of the game for that. But it does mean that as you start reducing the player count, the amount of the table talk and the amount of my enjoyment of the game definitely does go down. To the point that as a 2-player game, it's probably not my favorite game. I probably wouldn't play this as a 2-player game. While I enjoy playing as Dracula, I don't enjoy playing all 4 of the hunters. It's a lot to keep track of, and I know that sounds really odd to say, but it's just the theme of it kind of disappears when you play with two players. I don't like having to keep track of all the separate decks of cards. It just seems like a lot to do, and again, it loses a little bit of the theme of the game. The game is still pretty decent as 3 players, but even as a 3-player game, it's just not as fun as the 5-player game, because while only 2 players are each controlling 2 hunters and it's a little bit less confusing, you still get a lot less of the table talk, and the table talk is definitely what I enjoy most about the game, because it fits the theme of the game. You're Dracula, you're the evil Lord of Darkness, you have your spies everywhere, all over the place, whether it happens to be bodyguards, whether it happens to be vampires, whether it happens to be just mobs of people who want to ensure that the Lord of Darkness continues his evil ways. It really fits the theme of the game. But again, when you reduce the player count, you lose a little bit of that theme. And you also add to the confusion, and the gameplay does seem to slow down when you start reducing the player count. Especially, again, like I said, in a 2-player game where one person is controlling all 4 of the hunters. It kind of makes the game seem like it's kind of dragging a little bit. And the reason why that becomes more apparent in the lower player counts is because Fury of Dracula is a game that has an ebb and a flow to it. You see it in my video, especially if you watch the sample gameplay video. For the first couple of days, matter of fact, if I remember off the top of my head, I think till about Thursday, the gameplay, it's really not that exciting to watch. And I know it's not that exciting to watch, and that's why I didn't do a full 2-hour video showing all the gameplay, because the game definitely has its ebbs and its flows where the game is really exciting. Then you have your points where it's very laid back and very calm. You don't see a lot of things happening, especially when Dracula's playing the role of the mouse. As soon as Dracula starts playing the role of the cat and he's going on the prowl and he's hunting down the hunters, trying to separate them so he can pounce on a lone hunter, because Dracula is nearly unstoppable when he's alone versus one hunter, that's when the excitement, that's when the tension ramps up. But when you reduce the player count, you lose a little bit of that fun and a little bit of that tension. So my bottom line here is, while Dracula is a fantastic game, it's fantastic at a 5-player count. It's still decent at 3 players and still okay. Well, it's still good at 4 players. I hate the fact that at 4 players, one person has to control 2 hunters, but it's not that bad. But when you start breaking the game down as a 2-player game, while it's still good mechanically, it loses a little bit of the theme, and it's just not as fun as I like it to be. There's also 2 minor quibbles I also have with the game, and I think they are both missed opportunities for Fury of Dracula. The first thing, and the one thing that was really big for me, especially as somebody who has played the game many times before and owning their earlier editions, I think them not including a little shield to put in front of the map so Dracula can make all his movements in secret, having some kind of shield or something like that, that would fold around much like the first edition does, so Dracula can make all his movements in secret. And I mentioned this in my playthrough video. What I always do is I use the first edition shield, and I use a bunch of little cubes that I put on top of every single city, so I, as Dracula, can track all my movements, so the players, the hunters, have no idea where I'm going, because I'm not telegraphing my intentions by watching the map. And I'm also not telegraphing my intentions because when you don't play with a shield like this, when the tension gets high and you start having multiple hideouts and you start having multiple layers, especially with the layers, it's going to get to the point where the hunters are going to say, okay, are you as Dracula and Marcel's? Wait, no, I'm not. Okay, are you as Dracula? Are you a Milan? No, I'm not a Milan. And that's what I really don't like, because it starts telegraphing Dracula's intentions. And that's going to happen a lot when you're first learning how to play the game, because you're going to be so busy as a Dracula player trying to remember all the rules and all the minute details. It's going to be much harder to remember your exact trail and your exact locations and your exact hideouts. And that's why I think it really was a missed opportunity that I'm not including some little markers and a little shield, which probably would have added probably about $1 to the cost to manufacture the game, if even that. But it will add it immensely to the game, and that's why I actually recommend, when you play this game, go out there and get a little shield of some kind, make one out of construction paper, whatever you want to do, and then go out there and get some little cubes so you can mark exactly which cities you're going through, marking the cities you're traveling through, and it's going to make everything a heck of a lot more fun. You're going to telegraph a lot less as a Dracula player, and you're going to enjoy your role as a Dracula player a heck of a lot more if you do that. And then there's one other thing that I was kind of annoyed with that I thought for the new players would be very, very frustrating. Now again, for somebody who's played the game before, not that bad. For the new players, it's going to be very, very frustrating. And that's going to be the inconsistency of the encounter cards. Now the rules for the encounter cards say that unless an encounter card says so, after it's used for its ambush effect, it's basically going to be discarded. Except they miss one caveat to that, because if it's a vampire, the vampires break the rules, because the vampires don't actually say on them that when they ambush, if they survive the ambush, they actually stay on the trail. So it's kind of a minor inconsistency, and it is something that's going to annoy new players because they're going to be frustrated with that, because it's basically the rule, as it's not really written in the rule book, is that an encounter card, if it's used for an ambush, is discarded unless it's specifically on the card says that the ambush card stays. And of course, unless it's a vampire, because vampires break that rule. So it's kind of frustrating on that. And it would have been nice if they fixed it. I'm hoping in the next reprint of the game they actually fix that and put down on all the vampire cards that vampires always stay on the trail. The bottom line here is, aside from a very small minor missed opportunity with the shield and a very small minor detail with all the encounter cards, this is a fantastic addition of the game. Now again, like I said, I skipped the second edition, but this edition has basically allowed me to shelve my first edition, stick it in the garage, and I don't ever have to worry about pulling it back out. Except for the shield I stole out of it, because again, I do definitely use the shield with the map when I play the game, because I think it's the best way to play the game. Overall, I think this is a fantastic game. It's an awesome representation of the genre, the hidden movement, and the hidden deduction game. Aside from the fact that it plays best with the max amount of player count, you can't say anything really wrong about Fury of Dracula. I hope you enjoyed this video review. If you have any comments or questions about Fury of Dracula, or any comments or questions, make sure you leave them in the YouTube comments down below. You can also feel free to email me at offtheshelfboardgamereviews, that's otsbgr@gmail.com. As always, if you enjoyed this video and this video series, press that like button. And if you want to see more, please subscribe. Thanks for watching.